Hello, we're really pleased to welcome you all to the first of our expert seminar series. This introductory seminar to influencing policy is the first of 3 seminars which are designed to support organisations to understand the process of policy influencing and how to start to identify and increase opportunities to influence. Seminars are part of Clinks' new Stronger Voice project, which seeks to ensure that the voluntary sector has a strong, confident voice and is equipped with the skills and confidence to influence effectively. So we will be delivering other online training events if you're interested in future, so watch out for the updates in Light Lunch. I'll now hand over to Nicola Drinkwater, Policy Manager at Clinks, who is presenting the seminar today.
Thank you. Yes, and just to reiterate what Sophie said, we're really excited to be able to launch our expert seminar programme, and I'm really pleased to be able to kick off our first one. So, and it's a little bit strange because I know there's quite a few people here, but I can't actually see anybody. But I suppose that's the joy of Zoom at the moment. And I've seen from the delegate list, as Sophie mentioned earlier, some of you are kind of well versed in policy influencing. You'll have done it many times and can feel like you're kind of bread and butter your every day. But also aware that some of you may be quite new to influencing policy, or it might be something that your organisation does that you want to learn a little bit more about and think about how that relates to your role. So hopefully today can kind of meet all of your needs and expectations. But apologies in advance if some of it is perhaps old hat or really familiar to you. But I think it's useful sometimes to take a step back and reflect on why you might be doing what you're doing, especially at the moment when things are incredibly busy, and I don't imagine you have a lot of time to have any headspace. So we've got quite a lot to cover today, and as Sophie mentioned earlier, we're really keen to make the session as interactive as possible. So I'll go through things as quickly as I can, really, because I want to make sure that we have ample time for discussion and debate and start thinking about what policy influencing can look like for your work. So I'll give a very brief introduction to policy influencing. I think everybody here, I imagine you're all very familiar with what we mean, but sometimes it's helpful to kind of come back to the starting point. And Clinks, we're very conscious of our language and how we say things and why we say things. So we're very clear that we work to influence policy. We're not a campaign organisation, and there's lots of reasons for that. So I'll talk about that in a bit more detail later. And then I'll look at some examples from Clinks's work and think about why we do what we do, why we have the approach that we take to influencing policy. And I'll be as open and honest as I can about some of the risks and the challenges and some of the discussions that we keep alive within our policy team, where we're sort of consistently reflecting on the way that we do our work and how we can have the best impact. And then we've got time for discussion. So we'll go off into discussion groups, and then we'll bring everybody back and think about sort of hints and tips about how you can start to influence policy in your work if you haven't already. Just some things to consider, questions you might want to ask yourselves. And we've got some examples from our work about how different ways that we've worked to do that. So essentially, policy influencing, as I'm sure you all know, it's quite simple, really. It's where you've identified a problem, you've seen a challenge, and I think if I asked all of you to keep in your mind a problem that you see, either with your everyday work or something that the people that you support experience, I imagine you can probably come up with quite a few. And if you're thinking about some of the challenges that you see, often I think a lot of those are structural challenges. So there's reasons why those challenges exist. So if I think about universal credit, for example, if you see challenges with people being able to access that, that's a structural challenge because there are decisions that have been made along the way to make that programme the way it is. So if that's the case, then some of those decisions could be remade or rethought, or things could be done in a slightly different way. So when you think about influencing change, you've seen a problem, there's a challenge there that you want to make a difference on, and then you have an idea of what that solution is. And obviously problems can be very diverse, and the solutions to those challenges are the same. So if you're thinking about change, that could be a legislative change, it could be a change to a local policy, it could be a change around funding, it could be just a change around practice, of how a prison might operate, for example, like how are they engaging with the voluntary sector. So there's lots of different ways that you can work to think about what those solutions can be. But generally, when you're looking at change, you see there's a problem, you know what the solution is. And then when we're talking about policy influencing, you work with the decision maker to try and resolve that problem. Think about how you could work together to make things better for people that you're working to support. I did want to pause here, because often when you're working to influence change, it's incredibly helpful to come with a solution and recommendations. I think decision makers find that invaluable. It really helps. It helps kind of support their work, and helps, I think, sometimes for them to see what's possible and what isn't, although obviously they're working within their own parameters and they have their own demands on their time or what they can and cannot do. But sometimes it's really important when you're working to push for change to identify a problem and put that problem on someone's kind of agenda for them to see that it's an issue. And if you think about some of the influencing work and sort of campaign work that's been done by the voluntary sector, a lot of that is to start to put issues on people's desks. So if you think about things like the Transition to Adulthood Alliance and thinking about young adults who are aged 18 to 25 and thinking of those people as a specific cohort that need a unique response, I would say that might not have been in people's minds maybe 20, 15 years ago, but now I would like to say that it is. So sometimes in your work, it's really important just to identify that challenge, because once people are on board with that being a problem, actually then you can start to think about, well, what do we do about that? So as I mentioned, there is a difference between policy influencing and campaign work. And it's not to say that they're sort of incredibly distinct from each other, like they marry together. The world isn't black and white, is it? So there's kind of grey within those different approaches, and they have loads in common. So when you're campaigning or influencing policy, they both start with a problem and they both have the solutions in mind. But as I mentioned, Clinks are we're very clear that we work to influence policy, and that really informs the way in which we do our work. So we've borrowed this diagram from NCVO and have lots of really helpful resources about this. If you wanted to look at our website, we've got a slide at the end that has useful resources and links on it. But we thought it would be helpful just to pause and think about the difference in approaches, because it could inform some of the way in which you want to take forward some of your influencing work. So when you're thinking about campaigning, and if you think about some of the campaigns you've seen, they often work sort of outside of government. So they look to galvanise support, bring people together for this kind of shared aim, this kind of often one single campaign aim. So that might involve working with MPs or the general public. You might speak to the media. So you're kind of raising a collective voice about something. And if I think about some of the campaigns I've seen sort of within the voluntary sector working in justice, some examples spring to mind, such as Women in Prisons campaign to reduce the women's imprisonment to number of women in prison to 2020 by 2020. So obviously there's a very clear aim and a clear sort of deadline. Also have Revolving Doors Agency, who ran a campaign to reduce the use of short-term prison sentences. So again, a very clear aim. So those pieces of work sort of galvanise lots of support for their work. And I'm sure you can think of lots of other examples, either within kind of the criminal justice campaign world and outside it. So one example at the moment is around kind of school meals or free school meals for children. And you can see how that campaign sort of outside of justice is sort of being led and run. And as I've mentioned, the sort of tactics and strategies are around building pressure and political pressure to push for that change. But sort of on the flip side, or the other end of the spectrum, so to speak, when we're looking at policy influencing, you often do that sort of from inside government. So it would be about developing relationships, working closely with decision makers, thinking collaboratively about how you can work to implement the change that you'd like to see. But it's important to note within that, you obviously have your own role, and it's important sort of to be independent, of each other. So obviously, when Clinks is working with MOJ, we're very clear we're Clinks, we're the voluntary sector representative. MOJ have their own remit, but we still work in a collaborative, sort of critical friend way with civil servants. Often when we're thinking about change, it's more of a longer term aim. So we're doing some work at the moment to try and influence the probation reform programme. And although there are sort of wins we'd like to see along the way and like specific things that we look to try and influence, we're thinking really long term about the voluntary sector's role in the delivery of probation services and what that means for the people that you work to support. So it's often a very, very long term process. And as I've mentioned, sort of the tactics are around sort of critical friend relationship. And I can reflect a little bit later about what we mean by that and some of the challenges and risks associated with that approach. But as I've mentioned, sort of campaign work and policy influencing work, although are quite distinct from each other, there are lots of sort of voices within the criminal justice influencing space, and it's really, really important that there are, and we're very proud to work to represent such a diverse range of organisations and to work really closely with our members who have a different approach to us, and there are lots of reasons why that's the case. So we have a few examples of organisations that do sort of campaign work or influencing work on the slide. This isn't the full list of our members that do this, and we're very, very conscious this is just an example of some of our members. So if you don't see yourself there, we see you, and we know you're there, and we know what you're doing. So it's just to provide some examples. And it's really useful, I think, for the sector to work as collaboratively as possible, and we see that a lot. But when organisations that have more of a campaign voice and sort of work sort of outside government and kind of galvanise that support in quite a vocal way, often they can work with us as more of a sort of policy influencer to share messages, share support, and almost sometimes you describe it as a bit of a pincer movement. You're moving towards the same aims, but you're doing it in a slightly different way. And sometimes with our work, if we feel that we can't perhaps be as strong in our voice as we'd like to, because of some of the kind of stipulations we might have on the way that we need to work, we can sometimes speak to organisations that have more of a campaign voice and say, "Oh, we're really struggling with this, and we're not really getting as far as we'd like to. Is there something that you could do to support us?" And vice versa, if organisations that are more campaign focused and are coming up with real blockers, there can be things that we can do to support them. So it's really, really important that we have a range of voices working. Essentially, often we're working towards the same aim, but there's often, and obviously there's nuance between what you would ask for and how you would do it. And it's also important to note, I think, that organisations they're obviously really guided by their charitable aims and objectives, and obviously that's really necessary. But some organisations choose to work in a certain way because they think that's kind of, not, I don't want to say sort of morally acceptable, but for them it suits better with their values. So some organisations say, we don't receive money from government, we work outside government, we're a campaign organisation, and that is their value and their ethos, and they stand really strongly on that, and that's really important for them. And it's really important that as different voices in the sector that we see that and we respect that, and we all work together as far as we can. So that kind of moves me on to think about, well, how do Clinks influence? What are some of the tactics we use? How do we go about it? And some of the reasons why we do what we do. The first thing for us is that we are guided by our members and your needs, and the challenges that you're seeing, the issues you're experiencing, and our work absolutely needs to be grounded in that reality and reflect back up to decision makers and government the issues that you're seeing and what we think the solutions to those should be. So a lot of our work is obviously guided by the fact that we're a membership body, and we need to remain true to that because that's our purpose and gives us legitimacy. But our work, as I said, we work to influence, so we tend to work with civil servants a lot, mainly within MOJ and HMPPS. But we do recognise that a lot of the decisions made within other government departments, such as MHCLG or DWP, will have an impact on people within the justice system. Often government can be set up in quite a siloed way, but that's not how we live our lives. So we do work with other departments, including the Cabinet Office, where relevant and where we can. But our kind of key area of focus at that kind of national level tends to be within MOJ and HMPPS. We've also sort of forged links and relationships with the Justice Select Committee. They're a really important stakeholder for us. Obviously, they run lots of consultations and calls for evidence, so we often engage with those and speak up on behalf of the voluntary sector through those avenues. We also sit on lots of government advisory boards, and some examples of that. So we sit on the advisory board for female offenders, which is chaired by Minister Lucy Fraser. We sit on the external advice and scrutiny panel for the implementation of the LAMI review. And we also sit on the family strategy working group for the Farmer review. So that is a HMPPS group that tracks the progress of implementing the recommendations from that work. And there's lots of other groups that we sit on that I won't go into now because I don't think we have time. And our role on those groups will really differ depending on who runs them and who else is sitting on them. So sometimes we'll be there to represent the voluntary sector. We're the only voluntary sector representative there, and we'll try and sort of forge as many opportunities as we can to bring in our members into discussions and debate. But sometimes we sit alongside our members on those groups. So the ABFO Advisory Board for Female Offenders, we sit alongside our members that provide gender-specific support to women or work to campaign around women in justice. So we work there to support their messaging and work collaboratively across the sector with them. Also, as I've mentioned, we respond to consultation. So as you know, when government are thinking about kind of their plans and what they want to implement, often they'll consult on those. We've seen recently that sometimes consultation might not happen in the way we'd like to see, or with the sentencing white paper, which was obviously published quite recently, there was no room for consultation in that, which we're pretty disappointed about. But there are often lots of consultations about justice coming from government or Justice Select Committee, and we do our best to respond to as many as possible, depending on capacity, but also what those topics are, what issues they're looking to explore, and whether we're the best people to respond. If you're interested in looking at those and reading them, we have a publications page on our website, and we publish all of them there to be as transparent as possible. So please do take a look at that. And we also have our area development team, who some of you, I imagine, will know really well. So we have colleagues working in the Northwest, Northeast, Southwest, London and Wales. And they essentially deliver sort of local policy work. And we work really closely with our colleagues in that team to ensure that our national work speaks to their local work, and we're picking up issues that are happening across different parts of England and Wales. Just to focus on Wales for a little bit, obviously we work across England and Wales, and justice isn't devolved, but other policy areas that impact people in the justice system are. So obviously housing, accommodation, social welfare and health are all devolved. So we keep a really close eye on what's happening in Wales and think about, well, what the decisions being made in Westminster and being made kind of by MOJ and HMPPS, what does that mean for Wales, and what do we need to do in our policy work to make sure we're representing our members appropriately there. So one of the kind of main forums we have for influencing is our Reducing Reoffending Third Sector Advisory Group, or the RR3 for short, because it's quite a long name. So that is a voluntary sector advisory group to the Ministry of Justice. And it works to build kind of mutual understanding and strong and effective relationships and partnership working between sort of officials in the voluntary sector. So that group is made up of voluntary sector representatives, and they all come sort of representing themselves and their knowledge and expertise rather than their organisation. And they're all openly recruited to sit on that group. So I think we have about 16 members at the moment, and they have diverse sort of knowledge and experience. So some people there have lots of knowledge about the women's sector, others work in housing, some have knowledge around drug and alcohol misuse services. So we've tried to make the group as diverse as possible to kind of represent the sector's sort of needs and experiences as much as we can. So that group meets quarterly, and senior civil servants will attend that group so that it can be sort of discussion and debate about policy issues of the day. And we also have the ability to bring together sort of special interest groups or groups to focus or take a deep dive into certain policy issues. So we have two at the moment, one looking at probation reform and one looking at the impact of COVID-19 on the voluntary sector. So those distinct groups meet quite regularly, and they're a way to kind of broaden out the RR3's reach. So we've invited organisations who are wider than the sort of 16 RR3 group to take part in those discussions and in that work. We publish all of the minutes from those meetings, and we're trying to be as transparent as possible and kind of lead by example in some ways and frame how we would like to see advisory groups work and be operated. So we try and be as open and transparent as we can with that work. And again, we have a page on our website for the RR3. So please, if you're not kind of already really familiar with it, please do have a look. So as I've mentioned, there are lots of reasons why we take the kind of influencing approach that we take. And I think it's fair to say that we're always really reflective about what we do and why we do it and how. Because I suppose with anything, there's never always a kind of right or wrong answer, and it always depends contextually on what's happening in the kind of external environment, what resource you have, from our perspective, what the voluntary sector is saying, where the opportunities are. So we're really reflective about how we do things and whether it's the right way to do it. But we have made a strategic decision to work in an influencing way rather than a more kind of campaign-focused way. And from our perspective as a membership body, we feel that that's the best way for us to make a difference on behalf of the voluntary sector. So we feel that working as a critical friend allows us to open doors for the voluntary sector that might not have been open before. And it can mitigate some of the risks of campaigning, where sometimes you could, if you're campaigning in a way that can build political pressure, sometimes there can be a little bit of fallout from that. And from our perspective, we can't often risk that way of working, because we need to make sure the door isn't shut for the voluntary sector, that you can always engage in discussions if you want to, and if it relates to your work. Also, our organisations that we support are incredibly wide-ranging. So everyone here today will deliver different services in different parts of the country. Some of you are really small, community-based, others of you will be quite big. So we're representing a really wide range of interests. So for us, it's really important to balance those interests and make sure that we remain true as much as possible to your needs and wants, so to speak, but also represent the nuance between your needs, because often I would say that organisations are looking to achieve the same aims, but there are different things you'll need along that journey to get to that same point. So we are reflective and conscious that we need to balance all of that, and that can be a tricky line to tread, but again, we're really conscious of it, and we do our best to represent everybody as accurately as we can. It's worth highlighting that we receive funding from the Ministry of Justice. So we received the infrastructure grant from the MOJ, which for us, it does open lots of doors, and it gives us legitimacy. So when we're saying to some civil servants who might not have thought about the voluntary sector when they're working on certain things, we can say, please come to us, you pay us to do this, we can help you, we can reach out to the voluntary sector, we can bring people together for you. So we're often the interface between the sector and officials. But the flip side of that, it does mean that we have to be really conscious of how we go about our influencing work, how we say what we need to say, whilst remaining true to some of the challenges that we see from the sector. So we need to manage those relationships quite consciously. But also, I did want to go back to my earlier point about saying civil servants, please come to us, we can support you to engage with the sector. We're also really conscious of not acting like gatekeepers. So where we can, we sort of forge links between organisations and create opportunities where possible for you to represent yourself, because that's incredibly important in its own right, and also for the people that you support to be able to represent themselves or be part of sort of influencing work. So we're really conscious to create those opportunities where we can, or publicise them if they're happening. And the thing I just wanted to cover before handing back over to Sophie and going into the group discussions is that working in a kind of critical friend relationship way can be challenging when you're thinking about how those relationships can be perceived. Because sometimes if you're working sort of, think about the diagram that I spoke to earlier, you're working within government, you're seen to kind of work alongside people. Sometimes there can be a perception that you're very close to government, and how do you remain independent from that as an organisation? And we're really clear that we are, and the voluntary sector's needs and experiences are the thing that we need to sort of influence on, and that's the main thing in our mind. So we'll always remain true to that, but we do need to be conscious that we are independent, even if we're working closely with decision makers. And it's fair to say sometimes decisions might be made that we don't necessarily agree with, and find, sometimes you can see decisions can be made that could have quite a detrimental impact on the sector or people with lived experience. So in those instances, it might well be that we could write a public letter or publish something that is stronger than what we would normally do, because we need to remain true to our kind of core purpose. So as I've mentioned, we're constantly thinking about the best way to influence, and how that can work best to get the aims that we'd all like to see. For the second part of the session, we thought it'd be helpful to give a few kind of hints and tips, and things to consider when you're working to influence change, whether that be through a more kind of campaign lens or through a more sort of policy influencing perspective. So some of this may well be really familiar to you, but as I mentioned earlier, sometimes it's helpful to take a step back from your day-to-day and reflect on, okay, why am I doing it in this way? And could there be another option if I'm not quite getting the outcomes that I'd like to see? So obviously the first point really is to think about what the issue is, and really begin to understand where it's coming from. So as I mentioned right at the beginning, when you're working to influence change, the first thing you start with is a problem. You've seen something that you'd like to make better or make a difference about. So the first step really is to think about, well, why is this happening? Try and get to the kind of nub of the issue. Like, where is it coming from? What do you think needs to change? And start to develop your kind of knowledge and expertise around that kind of challenge or issue. At that point, when you're kind of starting to feel your way with something that you've seen, so it might be that you've seen it in your kind of day-to-day, working with your colleagues, or the people that you're working to support might start kind of bring issues to you, or you might start hearing the same challenge. So it could be that accommodation is incredibly challenging to access, and you hear that on a more regular basis. So kind of reach out to your networks, the people that you work to support, to start to develop a kind of detailed picture about what it is that's happening and why. And as part of that work, sort of doing kind of building the evidence base, doing some desk-based research can often be really useful as a kind of starting point. And that can help you start to develop your thinking around kind of what's happening with the external environment around that challenge, who else might be involved in either campaigning or influencing around that, what other organisations might exist for which this would be a priority issue for them. Have there been consultations about it, or things that pop up that are related to the issue or challenge that you're seeing? So you can start to kind of build a bit of almost momentum in your own thinking around this problem and challenge. And once you have a really clear idea of it, then you can start thinking about, well, where do I go with this stuff? What do I do about it? And we wanted to give an example from some of our work. So I'm sure a lot of you will have seen our Track TR project that we ran a couple of years ago. So that was a partnership project between us, NCVO, the University of Birmingham's Third Sector Research Centre, and the Open University Centre for voluntary sector leadership. So we worked with our partners essentially to track the voluntary sector's experiences of the transforming rehabilitation reforms. So as you all know, probation was reformed a few years ago, and obviously there's a really big reform programme at the moment about probation. And I suppose one of the really interesting things about justice is the kind of often reform nature of it. Things never really stay still for very long. Often once I've got my head around something else will change, which keeps us on our toes, I suppose, but often doesn't create a good environment for the people that we're looking to support if things are constantly in flux. So when we decided to do this project, the kind of driving force behind that was to really understand the voluntary sector's experiences. So we'd heard through our consistent engagement with our members that there were challenges, there were issues, and we really needed a kind of evidence base to go back to, so that when we're saying, look, here are some of the challenges, this is how it's impacting the sector, we had something tangible to go back to. So we developed, I think it was 3 surveys and kind of ongoing research, and we published 3 reports under the kind of Track TR banner, so that we had something tangible that gave us legitimacy when we were working to influence change. And we sent that to lots of stakeholders. We kind of held an event to publicise the findings, but it gave us something that we could go back to, that supported us in the work that we wanted to do. And it took some of the sector's feedback that could be seen as anecdotal and gave it more legitimacy. It put it in the context of other people's experiences, and it gave us a really good evidence base through which to ground our policy influencing work. And I recognise that sort of research is one part of the puzzle, and it may not be appropriate, or you may not have the resource to do your own. There might be other research that exists out there, but for us, we felt that that was a really important thing to do, especially as a membership body representing the sector, and it really helped us in our influencing work around transforming rehabilitation reforms. And I would say that work has also been the groundwork for a lot of our work now around the probation reform programme, because some of the issues still exist, unfortunately. So it creates a good grounding for us. So once you know what your challenge or your problem is, and you know the detail around it, and you feel like you've kind of built up a picture about what's going on, who it's impacting, what that impact looks like, and you've got some voice and people that you work to support, and you know what it looks like for them if the problem kind of relates to their daily lives. There are a few questions that are quite helpful to ask yourself when you're developing your approach, and there's lots of ways you can go about working to influence change. But I suppose the first one is like, are you the right people to do this? Is it kind of within your charitable aims and objectives? Do you have that knowledge? You know, when you've looked at the problem, do you really feel that you can get to the bottom of it, and that it's something that sits with you as an organisation? And if you feel like, yeah, actually, that is for us, it's part of our core purpose, or it's really impacting the people that we work with, who else can you work with? Are there other organisations running campaigns, or is it something that's a priority for them that you could work with and reach out to and kind of support each other and lend your voices to each other's work? And that can be, obviously, that's incredibly useful. Collaborative working is really important. You're stronger together than you are sort of as individuals. But that can really help with resource. Now, obviously, resource is one of the key questions at the forefront of my mind whenever I think about the policy priorities that we have and the work that we undertake at Clinks, and I know it will absolutely be the same for you. So one of the considerations is, do you have the resource to undertake that work? And actually, if you work in collaboration with others, could you lend your resource to other people? Could they support you? And is there a kind of smarter way to use the resources that you have? The answer may well be no, and you might think, actually, this is something just for us. Or you might think, actually, yeah, there's something really interesting with this coalition or this group of organisations that I can work really closely with. Or you might decide to build your own coalition and kind of galvanise support from lots of organisations yourself. The other thing to reflect about resource is where you think it's best to place that resource. So we only have kind of finite resources. And again, we're really conscious of this at Clinks. That working within the criminal justice system, there are lots of challenges, and those challenges are incredibly historical, some of them are new. But there's a lot going on, and the criminal justice system is huge, and there are lots of challenges that we can think about and work to change. So sometimes you need to make a decision about where you put that resource. So I often think, okay, well, if you've got 5 issues that you see, do you want to work in a way where you kind of light touch, engage with kind of policy and campaigning about those challenges? Or do you think, actually, I'm better off focusing on 2 of them or 1 of them and just really gunning for it and having a really clear kind of sense of where I'm going to put my resource and my work? And as I mentioned earlier, the ways of working between campaign organisations and policy influencing organisations sort of and within the sector, sometimes you can lend your voice to something without using a lot of resource. So you might sign a letter, or you might attend a meeting, or you might send information to people that they can use in their work. That can be a way of kind of using your resource smartly and getting your voice out there without taking too much time from yourself. And sometimes we'll do that if there's something we want to comment on but don't have the resource to do a lot of proactive work ourselves. It's worth reflecting that when you think about who you need to influence or who those key stakeholders are, building those relationships can take a lot of time and a lot of resource. So I think when you're working with civil servants, for example, it can take some time to work out who the best person is and build up those relationships with them. But also people move around quite a lot, and we see that loads within the civil service. And so sometimes you can create a really good relationship and that person's moved. So that can take time to kind of maintain that approach. So again, it kind of comes back to how much time and resource you have. But when you're thinking about who you need to influence, there's often lots of stakeholders you can engage with. And it's important to think about who they are and what their needs are and what drives them, and how you can provide them with either solutions or kind of challenge or information that can help them achieve some of their aims. Because people are driven by what they want to achieve. How can you complement that? How can you kind of position yourself in a way that you're presenting the information that you have in a way that's kind of attractive to them? So you might not change what it is that you don't change what it is you want, but sometimes you might change the way that you might speak to somebody or engage with them because it speaks better to them. And there are lots of ways you can engage with different stakeholders. So you can be creative about how you do that. Obviously, at the moment, it's quite challenging. Sometimes you might want to invite somebody to your service, or you might want to invite them to an event that you're holding, or something really exciting or interesting that you're doing. Obviously, at the moment, it's quite challenging to do that, but it's not to say that that won't be something interesting you can do in the future, or that there aren't opportunities for you to do that now. And the other thing I think is useful to reflect on is where there are opportunities. So sometimes your work might be driven by what's happening in the external environment. And there's an example from our work that I can talk to in a minute. So if you're thinking about, so say the example I used earlier, you've got 5 problems that you think, I want to influence in all of these. There might be one of them that really links with a government priority or a consultation or a minister's kind of pet issue or thing that they're really interested in. If you can see a tangible opportunity there where you can direct your influencing work, sometimes that can drive what you prioritise and when. Because often, obviously, when you're thinking about change, it's, the part of it thinking about, okay, I'm putting a problem on someone's agenda that they don't know about. But the other part of it is if they already know about it and there's an opportunity there, then you can engage in that. So it's important sort of when you're thinking about the kind of desk-based research, of kind of thinking, well, where are those levers and what's happening at the moment, and could I complement that? So I just wanted to sort of end with 2 examples from some of our work and give some reflection about why we decided to work in this way. So I'm sure a lot of you will have seen the Making Every Adult Matter Coalition, which Clinks is a member of. And so 10 years ago, we decided to set up the coalition alongside Mind. It was DrugScope, obviously they've closed a couple of years ago, but they were one of the founding members, Homeless Link and Mind. And now we work with an associate member, Collective Voice. And we've joined together as a coalition for lots of reasons. So the first one is that we recognise there are groups of people who experience multiple disadvantage, for which services don't necessarily meet their needs. They fall through the gaps in provision. So we recognise that between our different organisations, there are a group of people who sort of link across the justice or homelessness or mental health needs or have drug and alcohol misuse needs. And so we identified there were a group of people that are kind of relevant, if you like, to all of our organisations. And we thought, well, if we come together to look at the issues they're experiencing and the solutions that we can push so that they get the integrated support that they need, we're stronger as a coalition and we can work collaboratively together to use all the kind of networks, the expertise that we have and the contacts that we have to really try and make a difference for that group of people who are often invisible and are missed out of kind of service provision. So now MEAN from 10 years ago has really sort of developed from strength to strength, and we have two arms of it, if you like, probably a slightly crude distinction, but we have some sort of practical work where our colleagues work in different local areas to support the MEAN approach, which joins up different services and to work collaboratively together. So we have 31 local areas that deliver that work. And to complement that, we have our policy influencing side of it, where we work really closely with those local areas to see what challenges they're experiencing, what we can do nationally to try and influence that. And again, we can then think, okay, what's happening nationally and how can we feed that down to those local areas so that they know what's happening. So, and one of the reasons why we set up the coalition was because we saw that those challenges were entrenched, and we thought, well, unless we put specific resource and time to look at trying to address them, they might not be addressed. They might always exist. So we thought, as I've mentioned, we're stronger together than we are apart. So we developed MEAN 10 years ago, and as I said, it's going from strength to strength. And the other example I wanted to talk through is our work around accommodation, which I think it's quite an interesting example of how one of our policy priorities really sort of came to be over the last couple of years. So a few years ago, we did a piece of research in partnership with Homeless Link to look at the impact probation reform was having on people's accommodation outcomes. So we did this sort of piece of research, and we found there were loads of challenges with accommodation, accessing stable, secure accommodation. And at the same time we did that research, our members were coming to us and saying, there's a real problem here and it's getting worse. I mean, it's always been a challenge, but we're really seeing things become more difficult. So we used that bit of research as a springboard, really. And it was almost like the perfect storm, but in a positive sense, that we had that research, we had sort of members saying to us, this is a challenge. And then there was an opportunity. So the minister at the time, they identified accommodation as a priority for them within the Ministry of Justice. And they recognised that they hadn't necessarily prioritised accommodation in the same way that they prioritised like resettlement issues, or I mean, I know it's part of resettlement, but other resettlement issues or other challenges for people in the justice system, and they'd really put it on their agenda. So there was a kind of an open influencing opportunity for us. So we used our R3 group that I mentioned earlier, and we pulled together a special interest group of voluntary sector experts who worked in accommodation to think about what the challenges are and how we want them to be solved. And our sort of overarching ask was for a long-term cross-departmental accommodation strategy. And we engaged with our members during that work, and we had sort of regular meetings to inform that. We had a meeting or event with people of lived experience to hear from them about their views. And we worked quite closely with the Ministry of Justice during that time to say, you know, here are our recommendations, you know, this is what we see as the solution. How is that going to land with the department? Is that useful? Do you think, do you think this can lead to a tangible outcome? And it's fair to say there, even if they say, oh no, that's not necessarily something we can deliver, that doesn't mean that we wouldn't ask for it. It might influence how we ask for it, but coming back to that point about being independent, there are some things that we feel that as Clinks and as the sector we need to ask for, even if it might not be possible to deliver and isn't a priority at that time. So that piece of work is, again, it's kind of the stepping stone or the groundwork for the accommodation work that we do. So because we have that RR3 paper and that kind of probation research we did, we always look back to them when we're doing that influencing work, and it really helps frame what kind of debates or discussions we get involved in, what we lend our voice to, how we position ourselves, and what work we deliver. Because it's fair to say accommodation is obviously a huge policy area in its own right. So we're really conscious of being clear that we're talking about justice, and that we kind of bring it back to the kind of core ask that we have for that cross-departmental strategy that I hope I see in my lifetime. But that was all I was going to cover. So I don't know if there's any questions. I'll hand back over to Sophie.
Oh, thank you, Nicola. Yeah, just to say apologies to everyone for the last section being a bit rushed. We'll try and pick up some of the key points of the feedback that you gave us, but just moving on to any questions really for Nicola. So I know there were a few posted in chat before. So I think the first one was from Olwain. Nicola, would you be able to answer his question, which was about, could you expand on the relationship between yourselves and campaigning organisations, of like when you decided to talk to them, act on an issue if your hands are more tied?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I would say, and there's lots of different ways that we do this, but I suppose within Clinks we have a clear idea of what our policy priorities are. And at the moment you might have seen that we're refreshing our Clinks Thinks document that kind of has all our policy priorities in it. So Sophie's leading that work for us. So we have a clear idea of what those priorities are. So if we're working on probation reform, for example, we'll engage with our members who are also working on that. So thinking about the kind of campaign policy organisations, we have different ways that we'll work with them. So it might be through specific consultations, or do kind of ad hoc meetings when people come together to share some of the challenges they're seeing or experiencing. So sometimes it's not a kind of clear-cut discussion when you're like, oh, there's a problem here, can you raise this for me? You kind of do it as you go, because you'll share your, or we share our kind of challenges, issues, the recommendations we're making. If we're writing a policy consultation, we'll send it to other people who we know are doing the same, so we can kind of share issues. And it might be that when you're sharing that, you put something on a campaign organisation's agenda that they might not have considered or thought about. And then if they do anything with it themselves, their approach will be quite different to how we might approach something. So there's lots of different ways that we do it, but I would say that often that just kind of happens quite organically. But for us, we know that if there is something that we're struggling to get buy-in for, or we think actually it might need a little bit of a stronger voice than we can give it, we kind of know in the sector the people who we could go to that might be willing to do that, either on our behalf or kind of within their own work. But there might be a fuller, I might be able to give some examples, but I can't think of them at the moment, but happy to follow up after if helpful.
Thank you, Nicola. Someone else, Savannah, she asked a question. She was wondering if the team had any advice about actually hearing about all the consultations coming up, as well as debates or plans, opportunities to influence government, and being as active as possible instead of reactive. So, so I mean, is there a practicality there about how to find out about consultations coming up? Lots of ways you can stay up to date, and I think the question about being proactive rather than reactive is a really important one, and something we grapple with, because often we have to be really responsive to what's happening. So there's lots of different things you can sign up to. So there's gov.uk,
And so Ministry of Justice and kind of HMPPS updates will come through that. And I would say select committees, you can sign up to receive emails from them. Obviously there's the Justice Select Committee, but there are others such as the Women and Equality Select Committee, who will do inquiries that are relevant to justice and will be relevant to the issues that you're seeing. So I would encourage you to sign up to them. There's also DODS. You can sign up to that, but I think you have to pay for it. And it's not something that we have at Clinks, but I know some organisations do have that. And some of our kind of members will sign up to that, but we don't, but it's an option if you think that's relevant to you. We have our weekly newsletter, Light Lunch, where we will do our very best to update everyone about opportunities that are happening or coming up. So if we're responding to a consultation, we always make that clear and we'll ask for feedback in that. But even if it's not something that feels like it sort of sits within our remit, if it's related to justice, we will include that in the newsletter. We also have a monthly policy bulletin, and we'll put opportunities in there. And Twitter is often a really good tool. It's obviously free, which is always good. And different newsletters, I'd say. So obviously we've got Light Lunch, but Criminal Justice Alliance have their own newsletter. Other organisations within the sector will kind of promote the work that they're doing. Agenda, the Women and Girls at Risk Alliance, have a kind of update letter. So they're really useful to sign up to because everyone has a slightly different focus. So you might pick up opportunities through there.
Thank you, Nicola. I was going to try and squeeze in one more question, but I'm not sure if we've got time. So Chris Hyde was just saying about his experience and about the distinction between campaigning and influencing. And from what he says, it feels like things have moved on from government being reluctant to engage with campaigners to now actively seeking organisations and influencers' input. So just very briefly, Nicola, do you think that is the case for MOJ and HMPPS or not?
Yeah, really, very good question. And I might need to ponder it a little bit. My first response is that I suppose especially the people that we work with are really keen to engage with the voluntary sector. And I have, I suppose I've seen recently more proactive kind of steps within which to do that. And often I'll be at meetings and people will say, oh, we're doing this. And when I put my hand up to be like, you engage with the sector, before I even speak, they're like, yes, we're going to come to you, don't worry. So I think there is appetite, but then there's always that balance. There is appetite to engage and consult with people, but then the balance of what changes from that consultation and, are these things taken on board in the way that we'd like to see? That's always the other part of the coin, isn't it? But I would say there's an appetite to engage with people.
Brilliant. Thank you, Nicola, for answering all the questions. If anyone does have additional questions that we just haven't been able to fit in today, then please do let us know and we'll do our best to answer them. So I suppose the last part of our seminar is just to ask a question back to you. I know it was slightly covered in the breakout rooms, but just to start, for you to start thinking about what policy issues do you think you could have a role in influencing? It could be locally or nationally. So again, if you just want to write some things in chat, just so that everyone can have a look what other people are doing, that would be great. So as you were doing all of that, just to finish up, I would like to say, a great big thank you for everyone coming today and to contributing. An email will follow with all the seminar slides and also asking you your feedback. So please do let us know if there's anything specific that you would want covered in future seminars or that would be useful to you. And as I mentioned, we've got another 2 seminars coming up. Next week, we've got Chris Stacey, Director of Unlock. That's Thursday, the 21st of January. And he'll be speaking about Unlock's recent Supreme Court case win regarding criminal records disclosure. And then Mark Day from Prison Reform Trust will be talking about the role of influencing within PRT's work. So please do join us if you can. I think what I'll try and do is coordinate some of the feedback that you've given us from your group discussions and share that, because I think it would be quite useful for everyone to hear what other people were saying. I think a few of you talked about feeling like the operational frontline is disconnected from policy, and so wanting to connect more to those to provide solutions to issues. I also read with interest about the voice of practitioners and users of services not being heard in making policy changes, and the Daily Mail challenge, which I've heard of before. Like, will it pass the Daily Mail challenge if you were to read this in a newspaper? The example given in that case was about the COVID vaccines. I think the feedback also showed people grappling with the issues faced when they're trying to criticise public bodies or government or commissioners, and how those people can potentially be responsible for your funding. So there's lots of different challenges inherent in all of it. So I hope that you have all really enjoyed today's event, that you can complete the poll, and I think we've actually managed to finish on time. So I hope you have a good rest of your week and a weekend, and thanks again for attending.